more things on customs, then we'll move on to transport and insurance and documentation. A few times I've mentioned the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the TFA. I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but as last week, you will get copies of the pack, and if you want to look at the detail, you can do that. But the background goes back quite a long time, actually. And the main purpose of the World Trade Organization, if you said to them, what's your ultimate aim? What do you really want to achieve? When they were established over 50 years ago, they would have said, we want global free trade, because everyone could see the benefits of that. And they've certainly been really successful. If you look at average import duty rates, and of course the duty rate depends on the product, it depends on the country of import and whether there's a trade agreement. There's lots of variables. But average duty rates have gone down considerably. About 50 years ago, an average duty rate would be 20-25%. Now an average duty rate is about 2 or 3%. So, of course, with some products it's going to be a lot higher, some a lot lower than that. But that's the global average. And probably about 12 years ago now, the WTO considered, okay, we've probably gone as far as we can on getting near to global free trade. We'll never have global free trade, but we've got as near as we can. What other barriers are there to international trade? And they looked at the non-tariff barriers, and it was quite right they did that. And they appreciated that actually, and this is a theme which you'd have seen over the last sessions, the cost of doing international business can be really high because of processes, procedures, customs formalities, having to prove that you've done the right thing, documentation, all these kind of things. They really are a cost to business. And the WTO recognized this and they said, okay, we've got to have an agreement on the non-tariff barriers, not the tariff barriers. We've done probably as much as we can on duty rates. Now let's have a look at the other things which make international trade expensive. So they bought out the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and the agreement's got, as I say, I'm not going to go into huge detail, just so that it exists really. But it's got three major aims, three objectives: to speed up the movement, release and clearance of goods traded internationally, to improve cooperation between customs authorities and other regulatory bodies, and to build capacity globally to make international trade more facilitated. So those are the stated aims of the agreement. And what's interesting here, without going through the details of the timeline, suffice it to say that the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement was the first trade agreement, the first international agreement, which came into force early. No other international agreement has ever done that. Round about the end of 2016, if people said to me, when do you think the agreement will come into force? I and people like me who were commentating on it said probably about 2020, 2021. But the WTO rule is that when 2/3 of the membership agree to something, it comes into force. And what happened was at the end of 2016, suddenly the EU ratified the agreement. That meant 27 more countries had ratified it. Because the EU ratified it, a bundle of other countries ratified it in January 2017. And because of that, the agreement came into force in February 2017, much, much earlier than anyone ever expected. And that really goes to underline, I think, how important the agreement was. And countries, nations, realized the importance of the agreement. So there was a rush to ratify it, and it actually came into force in February 2017. And in the agreement, there's about 13 articles. And within those articles, there are about 70 activities governments have to do. And on the screen at the moment, I've just picked out, 6 of the activities out of those 70. And you can see what the activities are that I've selected. And underneath them, you can see the reduction in the cost of doing business when those activities have been implemented. So again, not going through all of them, but for example, if you look at the first one, simplifying trade documents. Okay, that reduced the cost of doing business by 3% for low income countries, 2.7% for lower middle income countries. Streamlining border processes, even for OECD countries, a cost reduction in 1%. Remember, OECD are the richest countries in the world. Automating trade and customs procedures, OECD countries, cost of doing business reduced by 2.1%. So as you can see, just picking out 5 or 6 measures out of the 70, you can see even just for those ones, a really big reduction in the cost of doing business. And that matters for traders. It means all your processes and procedures become simpler and the cost of carrying them out becomes less. Now, you probably can't read all of that, but basically the structure of the agreement is 3 sections. The first section are the technical articles. The second section are the rules for developing countries. And this is another interesting side to it, because many developing countries who are members of the World Trade Organization, they said to the WTO, okay, this is a really good agreement, but we're only Cambodia, or we're only Nigeria, or we're only Venezuela. It's really hard for us to implement the agreement. So we need to have a light version of the agreement. The WTO said no. They said absolutely not. The whole point of the agreement is that every country achieves the same standards in trade facilitation. So they said to developing countries, absolutely not. You have to achieve the same standards and the same requirements. However, we will give you more time to implement them. And if you need technical assistance to implement them, we, the World Trade Organization, will make sure you get that technical assistance. So section 2 is all about timescales and technical assistance for developing countries. And finally, section 3, that's the requirement that every country must establish a trade facilitation committee. And that committee is made up of public and private sector, and it will hold the government to account on implementing the agreement. So every country has one of those. The USA has one, the UK has one, the European Union has one in each country. Every country will have a trade facilitation committee. Some are more active than others. I'm involved in the UK one, and because I get pretty shouty about it. When they don't implement something they should have implemented, I do shout. Well, no, I don't shout. I try not to shout, but I do make the emphasis that to UK Customs, to the Department of Business and Trade, you really need to implement that very, very quickly. So that's what Section 3 is all about. Section 3 is a committee, public and private sector, that holds their government to account on implementing the trade facilitation agreement. Now, most of the approximately 70 requirements are compulsory. The agreement says government shall do it or shall not do it, but some of them are qualified. As you can see on the right there, some of them it will say implement this to the extent possible, or you're encouraged to do it, or implement them as appropriate. They tend to be the more minor parts of the agreement. But all the major parts of the agreement, governments are told, you shall do it, you shall do this, you shall implement a single window, you shall not delay consignments when they arrive in a port if you've got some queries about the clearance document. You must allow them to be delivered and then consult afterwards. So most of the provisions are mandatory. Government shall do them or shall not do them. And there on the screen, you can see a summary of the articles, what they're all about. Again, no time to go into huge detail here. But for example, Article 1, I think is going to be very, very impactful. And Article 1 says that every country must have a platform from which traders can get every bit of information they need in relation to exporting to any country and importing from any country. That platform should also allow them to make declarations, apply for export licenses. So in other words, it should be combined with the single window. And if any information is required, it should only have to be entered once. Now, When that's fully implemented, that's going to be really, really powerful. We don't have that yet in any country. The nearest we have is the European Union. Some of you will have used the Access to Markets database. And the Access to Markets database is really starting to implement Article 1. And then we have things like, very briefly, Article 2, opportunity to comment. Customs cannot bring in a new regulation until they've consulted with the trade on that regulation. So they can't say from tomorrow we're bringing in this new rule, this new restriction. There's got to be a consultation process. Advanced rulings, Article 3. If you want to get a ruling on something, then customs have to give it to you. Again, as I say, I'm not going to go into any great detail here. Article 7 is a very, very long article, all about the clearance and release of goods. And it's about things like implementing a single window, which we spoke about earlier today, allowing pre-arrival processing, that you customs clear goods before they arrive. You don't wait till they arrive and then start the clearance procedure. You clear them while they're on the high seas. You clear them before arrival. Payments must be allowed to be made electronically and so on and so on. Risk management systems have to be used. Cargo should not be delayed at ports, airports, inland clearance depots. If customs have any concern about a cargo, they should allow it to be delivered to the importer and then resolve the issue afterwards, so that you don't get big demurrage bills, big port detention bills, and so on. AEO, it states that there's got to be good benefits for the companies that are AEOs, and there must be good trade facilitation measures. I say no great detail, but if you look at Article 12, Customs Cooperation, if you look at the last point there, it mentions GNC. That stands for Globally Networked Customs. And that means, and this isn't going to happen quickly, but it means that eventually every customs authority globally will be interconnected with every other customs agency. Now, the beauty of that, it means we're getting away with this crazy situation where if I'm an exporter and you're an importer, I do an export declaration for my country and you do an import declaration in your country. But both those declarations have virtually the same information because it's the same consignment doing the same thing. The only thing that should be different is maybe the last few digits on the commodity code and the valuation, because the import valuation is going to be including transport and insurance, but everything else should be the same. So the main concept of globally networked customs is that when I do my export declaration, that automatically becomes the import declaration in the importation country. We no longer have two declarations. The export declaration automatically becomes the import declaration. And that has a lot of benefit. It saves having to do two declarations. It cuts down on fraud. It reduces the opportunity for errors in declarations and so on and so on. So that's what GNC is all about. So that's Article 12. We then have 10 articles for developing countries about longer timescales, getting technical assistance if they need that. So, countries like Zambia, Congo and East Africa, which export a lot of minerals, a lot of very high value and some lower value metals, that's really important to them. They're getting technical assistance in improving customs operations. So there are 10 articles about that, and Article 23 about establishing trade facilitation committees. Okay, any questions at all on customs operations before we move on? Okay, so moving goods around the world. And again, there's, many of you, this is your everyday business, you know all about this. But I think with green shipping becoming more and more important, there are gradual changes that we're seeing. But what are the options? Well, you can see the options on the screen at the moment. And certainly, by far, by tonnage, sea freight is still the most prolific way of moving goods around the world. And when we talk about sea freights, there are different ways of doing it. And the two main differentials, if you like, are liner shipping and charter shipping. Let's take the second one first. Charter shipping is a bit like hiring a car. It's when you charter a ship, you know, you need to have enough cargo to do it, but you charter a ship just like you would rent a car because you've got enough cargo to fill a ship that you want to move. And you charter the ship on a voyage basis or a time basis. A voyage basis means you're chartering it from one port of loading to a port of discharge. That's called a voyage charter. Or maybe you want to charter the ship for a period of time, for a number of voyages, and that would be called a time charter. And normally nowadays you would charter a ship with the crew. You know, it'd be a full charter with the crew. So when you're dealing with bulk commodities and large tonnages of bulk commodities, it may be that you would charter a ship to do that. But you need to have the volume to do it to make it cost effective. Okay, so the main type of shipping we have is called liner shipping. And liner shipping is where basically you're paying for the space you take on the ship and only for the space your consignment takes on the ship. And the definition of liner shipping is when a ship, a vessel, follows a route, and at every port on that route, it will discharge some cargo and it will load some cargo, and it follows a timed schedule. You know, the kind of thing all the major shipping lines do. MSC, Maersk Line, Evergreen, CGM, did I mention CGM? You know, all the major shipping lines, that's liner shipping, and you pay for the space you're taking on the ship. And again, with liner shipping, we can break that down into container shipping and bulk shipping. Sometimes bulk shipping is called conventional because it's the old-fashioned way of moving goods before containers were invented. But of course, not everything will fit in a container, so there's still a need for bulk shipping. There's not so much availability as there used to be, because now I think it's, you know, virtually true to say if a consignment will fit in a container, it will probably be shipped by a container. You know, even if it's a liquid, it will be a tank container. If it's a raw material like coffee beans, I did some work on the coffee value chain. Coffee beans, the way they ship those, for example, from Ethiopia into Europe, is they get a 20-foot container. Then there's a big plastic line that goes in that container. They call this a bladder. And they have a machine, and that machine shoots the coffee beans into the bladder. And they shoot 20 tons in. It's fascinating to watch. They shoot 20 tons of coffee into the bladder. They have another machine that sucks all the air out. They seal the bladder inside the container and they close the container doors. And that's how coffee is shipped nowadays. It was quite interesting. You know, I know you guys aren't involved in coffee, but it was interesting. I watched this being done at Djibouti port, and I was really impressed with it. And I was saying to the guys at the port who were showing me around, you know, this is really impressive. This is state-of-the-art machinery. And one of them said, yeah, it's great till it goes wrong. And I said, oh, does it go wrong regularly? And he said, well, the thing is, when you shoot the coffee into the bladder, you've got to get the speed exactly right. Otherwise, you no longer have coffee beans. You end up with instant coffee, which isn't what's being sold. So I think, you know, they had to get it fairly accurate. But the point I'm making here is that nowadays, you know, if a consignment will fit in a container, it's probably going to be shipped by container. Bear in mind, remember from the other, when we spoke about Incoterms, container shipping is multimodal. It's door to door. The container will be loaded at an inland point. It will then go by road or rail to the port of loading. It will then go on a ship to a port of discharge. It will then take its final delivery by road or by rail. So it's multimodal. It's unit load transport. It's much, much cleaner and more secure than conventional shipping. So that's sea freight. Most goods are shipped by sea. Remember, the overall quality of sea freight is it's slow, but it's cheap. You know, that's the way to look at sea freight. And it can handle large volumes. Now, however the cargoes move, there's probably going to be a road element to the journey. In some cases, the whole journey may be by road. Road freight, I mean, the advantage is it can be door to door if it needs to be door to door, which is an advantage. But of course, very, very big environmental issues. And because of that, now there's global policy and a lot of programs going on to get cargoes off the roads onto the railways. You know, the biggest program, of course, is the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative between Southeast Asia, between China and Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative, a huge, huge initiative. But, you know, it's based on getting cargoes off the roads and doing most of their journey by rail. And it will have a really big impact when it's implemented. We have air freight, of course. Air freight is the most expensive way of moving goods around the world, but it's the quickest. And remember, of course, one of the things to bear in mind is to look at, or, you know, as one of the metrics, to look at the mode of transport in relation to cash flow as well. Because remember, when a cargo is moving by sea, when it's on the high seas, it's got no, you know, I was going to say it's got no value to anyone. Well, of course it does have value, but it's no use to anyone while it's on the high seas. But when it's on an aeroplane, it's going to get to most places in the world within 24 hours. So that means the receiver of the cargo can get value of the cargo much, much quicker than if it's shipped by sea. So, of course, the freight's going to be more expensive, but there may be financial reasons why it's better to move it by air than by sea. There can, you know, just to get value for the goods much, much more quickly. And then we have multimodal. Container shipping is multimodal. It's road, rail, and sea, you know, so it's multimodal. The fastest growing multimodal system is actually sea air. That's really growing as a multimodal system, where the cargo does, for example, half the journey by sea and the other half by air. It's getting increasingly used between the Far East and Europe. It's cheaper than moving the cargo the whole way by air freight, but it's quicker than moving it the whole way by sea freight. So it's very, very much a compromise, but growing very, very quickly, in fact. And the two biggest sea air hubs is one in Singapore. There's a very big sea air hub in Singapore, and the other one at Jebel Ali in Dubai in the Emirates. A third is likely to open somewhere in Africa. It's not clear quite where that's going to be in Africa. I would put money on it. Well, not quite yet, but I may put money on it being somewhere in West Africa because of the way the economies are developing there. So sea air growing in popularity. And just some pictures, a standard road train, which is the terminology. Interestingly, different countries have different rules on the maximum weight you can have in road vehicles. So the unit you can see there in the picture, that would be completely legal in most European Union countries, but that would not be legal in the UK. In the UK, we have stricter rules on the amount of weight you can put in a vehicle on the UK roads. So, you know, we don't have harmonisation on axle weights. It's different in different countries, but that's what a standard road train looks like. There's a cargo aircraft. In fact, most air freight is carried on passenger aircraft. You know, where your luggage goes on a passenger aircraft, there's loads of room under there for cargo. And in fact, sometimes, you know, it's true to say that passenger planes, even if they haven't got one passenger, if their cargo hold is full, they can still be profitable on that journey. But there's a cargo plane. Not everything will fit into the cargo hold on a passenger plane. Sometimes cargo planes have to be used, and there's an example there. And there we have a block train. And as you can imagine, the big example of rail freight is it's much more environmentally friendly than road freight. So all the cargo you can see in that picture, if it was moved by road, it would be about 50 trucks, all spewing their emission all over the place. But put them on a railway and it's faster, it's more efficient, and it's more environmentally friendly. The disadvantage is, of course, the train can only go from railhead to railhead. There is going to be a rail journey before and at the end of the rail journey. But having said that, it's going to be a much, much shorter journey. And of course, some big manufacturers, like the steel manufacturers, they actually have rail sidings going into their works. So, as I mentioned, a really big incentive globally, lots of work being done on moving cargoes off the roads and onto the railways. Last week, you'll remember these pictures from last week when we spoke about Incoterms. Then we have conventional sea freight, the old-fashioned way of shipping where the cargo is moved directly into the hold of a ship. If you charter a ship for your commodities that you're selling or buying, if you charter a ship, then it will be conventional sea freight. The material, the metal, will be loaded directly into the hold of a ship. If it goes by container, it will be container shipping, it will be liner shipping, and you only pay for the cost of your container on that particular ship. It's quite an interesting metric, actually. You know, I always think, and I use this generally when I speak at conferences, it's quite interesting to look at what the big shipping lines are buying in relation to the size of vessels they're buying. After COVID, there was a really strong feeling that the shipping lines would cancel their orders for the very, very big post-Panamax vessels, for the biggest types of container ship. But they didn't do that. They didn't do it. They've gone ahead with the orders for the biggest post-Panamax ships, container ships. So container ships are continuing to get bigger and bigger. And that is actually a metric of the way economists see international trade progressing, which is a good sign. You know, I wouldn't say scientifically it's particularly 100% accurate, but it's a really, really good overall indicator. So that's interesting. The picture you can see there, that's by no means the biggest size container ship you get nowadays, but that gives you a kind of idea of a medium-sized container ship. I think you all know what a container looks like, but if you don't, that's a standard container. There we go. And that's a seal that you put when you've loaded a container. On the left-hand side of the picture, you can see the old-fashioned seal, still used, the very kind of flimsy steel band that you put around the locking point on the container. But nowadays, you tend to get bolt seals like you can see on the right. And the whole concept of containerization is that one of those containers, it gets loaded at origin, and it will be sealed at origin with a seal like that. And the seal should be intact when the container arrives with the final user, with the end user, with the consignee, with the importer. Now, if customs want to inspect the cargo, what they have to do is they have to break the seal, do their inspection, and then they have to reseal the container with an official customs seal and a declaration that they have inspected the cargo. But if there's been no customs inspection, you know, one of the key things that we train importers is when you receive a container into your warehouse, always make sure the seal number on the seal is the same as on the bill of lading at the time of export, because that shows that the seal hasn't been broken during the transit of the goods. It's a very, very elementary check, but it's a really important one. And every insurance company will ask for that if there's a claim. Did you check the seal number before you broke the seal on the container? So it's a small thing, but it is quite important. You know, really, really important that we look at the security of cargoes. That really does matter. You know, again, a very important theme now is supply chain security. So trends in logistic and distribution. The use of third and fourth party logistic providers, which has always been there. And I think, you know, when you're a manufacturer or a trader, an importer or an exporter, then there's always been a choice. Do you arrange shipping yourself directly with the carriers, directly with the shipping lines, the airlines, the truck companies, the rail companies, or do you use a freight forwarder, a third-party provider? And, you know, there are pros and cons, of course there are. Again, because of time, you know, we can't go through all of them. But I think, you know, the key thing is if you use a third-party provider, you rely on them to have, you know, for example, an agency network around the world. You rely on them to have good knowledge on the transportation of goods internationally and the procedures involved in that. And also, of course, the big thing is they may have better buying power with the carriers than you have. They may not, but they may do. So when they go to Maersk Line, they can say, we're going to ship 5,000 containers with you this year to Maersk Line, and Maersk Line will give them good rates, which they can pass on to you. Or it may be that you can get better rates than they can. But generally, they should be able to negotiate better rates than you could get directly. So that's the kind of advantage of using a third-party provider. Disadvantages, of course, you can lose control. That's the first thing. Secondly, you may be able to get better freight rates than they can. And, depending on your volumes of traffic, it may be you can negotiate with carriers better than a third-party provider can negotiate. And it does, as I say, it does give you that control. You're doing everything right because you're doing it yourself. So, there's a balancing act there. There's no rule there. It's what's best for your company. The theme in the 21st century has been just-in-time logistics. No one really wants to have to warehouse goods anymore. Or at least manufacturers, they want to reduce the size of their warehouses and reduce the size of their stock holdings. Because warehouses are expensive, you have to buy them or you have to rent them, you've got to heat them or light them or cool them, there's got to be people working there, you've got to guard them. There's a load of expense that comes with warehouses. And of course, if you hold stock, you're tying up capital. So if you look at the major manufacturers, and the best example of that are always the automotive companies. If you look at the car, truck making companies, they all work on just-in-time logistics, where all the components arrive just in time from their suppliers for when they need them on the production line. Now, the danger with that is that if the components don't arrive just in time, then there's only one alternative: they're just too late. There's nothing in between. You've got your BMWs on the production line rolling off the end, and there's one rivet they need. If that rivet doesn't arrive just in time, the production line will come to a halt. So just-in-time logistics, the intention is good, but the reality is you've got to have good, strong scientific logistics, which the automotive companies had, but they came a cropper in a big way during COVID. When points of supply couldn't supply anymore, the ports closed, and suddenly they couldn't get their components. And because of that, in Europe, to an extent in America, there's a move towards what's called near-shoring. And a lot of the major manufacturers are currently looking at the situation. Do we really want to be reliant on the Far East? Can we afford to be reliant on the Far East? Or should we look at having production much, much nearer the final manufacturing point and having our suppliers much, much nearer the manufacturing point in America and in Europe? And that's why there's so much interest at the moment in West Africa, because that would be a logical place. So just-in-time logistics, it's the way the world is going, but if it goes wrong, it does go very, very, very wrong. That's the issue. And I have to say there is a school of thought now that maybe just-in-time logistics have had their day. There is a school of thought in that maybe it's not the way forward. It's just too dangerous. And I think those discussions, I'm not sure I agree with them, but those discussions are always worth having and debating. And in fact, I'm involved in a debate on one of those discussions next week, which will be interesting. Okay. Smart intermodal logistics solutions. I think I mentioned last week that in the olden days, if you like, but it wasn't so long ago, most shipping was arranged on a port-to-port, airport-to-airport, railhead-to-railhead basis. Nowadays, people want door-to-door increasingly. If you order something from Amazon, you don't expect it to arrive at an airport and you have to go and collect it, or arrive at a warehouse and you have to go and collect it. You expect it to be door-to-door. And that's how commercial freight is becoming now. More and more, if you look at international supply chains, there's far more requirement for door-to-door shipping, and that needs smart intermodal solutions like the one I mentioned a few minutes ago, Sea Air. We've got freight rate volatility. We've had that since COVID, really, with freight rates going up and down. a lot of the shipping lines a couple of years ago were saying they nearly went out of business because they couldn't increase the freight rates as much as they wanted to, and they were struggling in a very, very big way. Did I have sympathy with that? Not really, for lots of reasons. But now there seems to be more of an equilibrium with freight rates. There's still some volatility, but they're more stable than they were 2 or 3 years ago. One important thing to remember is that if you use third-party logistic providers and those providers give you value-add services, for example, and very usually they make the customs declarations for you, remember they do that as your direct representative. And that means if they make a mistake, they won't get into trouble, you will. They're doing the export entry or the import entry in your name. Okay, so the golden rule is that if you do use third-party logistic providers, don't rely on them for information like what is the HS code of your product, what is the rule of origin. Don't rely on them for that. You know your product, you're in the best place to identify the correct commodity code to make sure the rule of origin is correct if you want to take advantage of a trade agreement. Because remember, if they make a mistake, you get into trouble, they don't. And the takeaway from that is if you do use brokers to do your import and export declarations, always get a printout of the declaration so you can check it to make sure it's correct. You know I've said this a few times, I promise I won't say it again, but if they make a mistake, you're the guys who will get into trouble with customs. So it's always good to do that as a practice. Get a copy of the declaration, check it, make sure it's correct. If there's any errors, then make sure the error is corrected in the correct way in the customs declaration. Okay, so very importantly, green shipping, a really important theme nowadays. Lots and lots of, as you can imagine, lots of work being done on this. And I'm not a technical expert on this, but when you read about the shipping industry, having ships run by electricity as opposed to other ways of powering them, there are very, very big technical problems with that. The main problems are battery problems, having batteries big enough to do it. So green shipping, a huge amount of work being done on that, but I think we have to be realistic. The move from road to rail I've spoken about, but there's still going to be an element of a road journey. I was doing some work last year, the year before last, in Zimbabwe, and they're looking at really increasing their road haulage, of having legislation to encourage the use of electric road haulage. Now they know to do that, they're going to need lots and lots and lots more charging points around the country. They know that, but they're really putting in some very, very good research into stopping diesel, petrol, road haulage vehicles and going to electric units. That's one example. And the other thing we're seeing is that global buyers are starting to say, we will not buy goods which have been shipped by air. So going back to Kenya that we spoke about earlier on this afternoon, a very, very big export for Kenya, or two very big exports, are floriculture, which is flowers. Virtually every flower sold in Europe at certain times of year has been grown in Kenya. It's a really big industry for them. And also produce, tropical fruits, those kind of things. Now, a lot of the UK and European supermarkets have said to their suppliers in Kenya, okay, currently we're chartering aircraft to move the produce or the flowers from Kenya into Europe. And they've started to say, now we want them shipped by sea. Don't ship them by air anymore. If you ship them by air, we're not going to buy them. And the technology is there. If you use reefer containers, refrigerated containers, maintain the correct ambient temperature in the container, you've got to have the fruit or the flowers at the right state of ripeness, if you like. But as long as you meet those requirements, they can be shipped by sea in reefer or chilled containers, and they will arrive 3 weeks later in the European ports in fresh condition to be sold in the supermarkets. And that trend is growing. where importers are saying, ship them by air, we're not going to buy them. We want them shipped by sea. Do your homework on it. Find out how we can ship them by sea safely. Ship them by sea safely, because that's what we want. So a very big subject, but green shipping and, of course, green ports. Green ports is a very big subject. Last year I spoke at the Green Port Convention. It's a very, very big subject, making ports greener, because, ports use a huge amount of power. So all that work is currently going on. Okay, any questions about transport, logistics, or distribution trends? Okay, so cargo insurance. Of course, remember from last week, responsibilities in relation to Incoterms. Remember, the Incoterm governing a contract shows where the risk passes from seller to buyer. And there's always a case to say that it makes sense to insure the goods as a seller or as a buyer for the part of the journey where you hold the risk. Having said that, do remember that there are only two Incoterms which make insurance compulsory, and those are CIP and CIF. The clue is in the I. If the Incoterm's got an I, then insurance is compulsory. And also, thinking back to last week, remember with CIP and CIF, the exporter must insure the goods even though they don't have the risk under those terms, but they're insuring the goods on behalf of the buyer and against the buyer's risk. It is the buyer that would make the insurance claim. So that's the response, that's the relationship of Incoterms and insurance. Incoterms will identify very, very clearly where risk passes from seller to buyer. Having said that, only two Incoterms where insurance is compulsory, CIP and CIF. Having said that, it does make sense to insure the goods as the seller or the buyer for the element of the journey where you hold the risk. Now, in terms of accessing insurance cover, there are different ways of doing it. If you're a prolific trader, importer or exporter, you probably have an open cover policy with an insurance company. And an open cover policy means generally you have a 1-year policy. On that policy, it will list the countries you're buying from or selling to. It will list the type of cargoes, and it will give you a rate schedule for insurance for those movements of cargoes. And every month you declare the cargoes moved to the insurance company. They send you an invoice and you pay them on a monthly basis. So open cover gives you a kind of overriding insurance policy. Or you may have specific cover, and that means you get transactional cover for every consignment that you have that needs insuring. You don't have an overall policy, but every time there's a cargo, you get an order, you get a cargo, you insure that specific cargo. There's no right or wrong there. It really just depends on the volume of traffic you're moving. If it's large volumes, it makes sense to have an open cover. If it's not large volumes, it may be better for you just to insure every cargo one at a time. You have a CIP or CIF transaction. When you insure a cargo, it will be insured for the transit risk. In other words, the standard risk of getting lost, damaged, broken, water damage, whatever that may be, plus the war risk. The war risk will always be included. So if the journey takes the goods into a conflict area for interest, for example, the Black Sea area, the Red Sea and so on, then the war risk element of the insurance is going to be higher. If it's low risk, for example, like the Atlantic, the war risk is going to be lower. So with the insurance rates, they're going to depend on what the commodity is, where the cargo is going from and where it's going to, how it's being shipped, and the risk perceived by the insurance company. Depending on all of that, they will give a rate for the insurance. And the rate for the insurance, that will be a percentage of the value of the goods. In insurance, there are standard insurance clauses that are used globally, and these are called the Institute Cargo Clauses. Those are standards that are used all over the world. They're issued by the Institute of London underwriters, but they're used globally. Okay, they may not be called the ICC, the Institute Cargo Clauses in every country, but every country will have something similar based on the Institute Cargo Clauses. And for ocean freight, for sea shipping, there are three clauses, A, B, and C. There are three levels of insurance. A is the highest level, it's all risks. C is the lowest level, it's total loss of the cargo only. And B is a compromise, it's something in the middle. And again, if you remember from last week, do remember that under Incoterms 2020, a very big change. If it's container shipping, it must have Clause A insurance, which is all risks. If it's bulk non-container shipping, then Clause C insurance is adequate. Because if it's non-container shipping, if it's bulk shipping, then the likelihood is that it's going to be bulk goods. They have a low value in relation to their bulk. It's going to be a CIF consignment, not CIP, and Clause C insurance would be satisfactory for that, and it's cheaper. So that's the big change in Incoterms 2020. Container shipping is CIP, and it will be Clause A insurance. Bulk shipping is CIF, and it will be Clause C insurance. Let's just go back. General average. Who's heard of general average? Anyone heard of it? Okay, let me talk for a few minutes about general average. So, occasionally, a ship can be put in danger, and to mitigate that danger, the captain of the ship may decide to jettison some of the cargo. In other words, to throw the cargo overboard. And the concept is the captain would jettison some of the cargo to save the rest of the cargo and to save the ship. And there are some quite recent instances of that. So the concept of general average means that if that's the case, the captain throws some cargo overboard and it saves the ship and the rest of the cargo. The captain then declares general average. And that means that everyone who's got a cargo on that ship whose cargo has been saved has got to pay a contribution to the companies whose cargo has been lost overboard. Because some people's cargo has been lost to save your cargo. So you have to compensate them for the loss. The shipping line declares general average. And that means when the ship arrives at destination, when it arrives at the port of discharge, the importer cannot take delivery of the cargo until they've paid the general average contribution, which can be very, very high. If the value of the cargo is high, the general average contribution can be high. But the importer won't be allowed to take delivery until they've paid their general cargo contribution. Sometimes the contribution can be higher than the value of the cargo, in which case the importer may say, I'm not going to take delivery. It's daft. You know, I'm going to have to pay more general average than the cargo is worth. Now, the good news about that is general average is an insurable risk. And that means if the cargo is insured, the insurance company will pay the general average contribution. If it's not insured, the importer has to pay it, otherwise they can't take delivery, and the cost can be really high. So if you hear the term general average, that's what it's all about. You know, it always takes people by surprise when they get a letter from the shipping line. You know, you've got a container on ship so-and-so going from this point to another point. Your bill of lading number is da-da-da-da-da. The captain has declared general average. Your contribution is going to be $25,000. And you will not be able to take delivery of your container on vessel arrival until you've paid that contribution. It takes people by surprise. But as I say, the good news is it is an insurable risk. That's what general average is. And then exclusions. You know, like with any insurance policy, there may be exclusions. And, you know, the golden rule is, like with so many things, if it seems too cheap, it's probably too good to be true. So if the insurance seems very cheap, have a look at what's covered. It may be the insurance company have put a load of exclusions on it, which could virtually invalidate the insurance. So always beware of exclusions. Most policies will have some exclusions and they can be very, very fair. But if there are too many exclusions, and if those exclusions are too burdensome, then it can virtually, eradicate completely the power of the insurance. So remember, in relation to Incoterms, only CIP and CIF make insurance compulsory. Remember, with CIP and CIF, the seller procures insurance, but it's for the benefit of the buyer because the buyer holds the risk. And remember, CIF, which is for bulk goods only, is going to be Clause C insurance. CIP is going to be Clause A insurance. Also remember, under Incoterms CIP and CIF, the goods must be insured for a minimum of 10% above the contract price. So if the contract price is $100, you must insure the goods for a minimum of $110. Okay, if you want to insure for 20% above the contract price or 30%, you can do that. But it's got to be for a minimum of 10% above the contract price in case of price escalation if the buyer has to reorder the goods. And do remember, we looked at this the other day when we looked at Incoterms. Under Incoterms CIP and CIF, it's very, very clear. Insurance shall be contracted with underwriters or an insurance company of good reputation and entitle the buyer or anyone else having an insurable interest to claim directly from the insurance company, simply because the buyer holds the risk. The insurance is on behalf of the buyer, and therefore the buyer must be able to make the insurance claim, even though the seller has contracted the insurance. And as I say, the insurance should be, as a minimum, 10% above the contract price. Also remember, from the importer's point of view, when making an insurance claim, importers are required to take prompt action. For example, if the cargo is in a warehouse and the roof is leaking, the importer would be expected to move the cargo from somewhere where it won't get wet. However, if the warehouse is on fire, the importer would not be expected to rush in and rescue the cargo from the fire. That would not be reasonable. But prompt, reasonable action by the insured is always a key element of an insurance claim. Complete and accurate documentation, and that includes using an appropriate Incoterm. If there is an insurance claim, the insurance company will want to see good contracting, good documentation, accurate documentation, and legal documentation. Remember, when you're importing, those of you who do import, never sign a clean receipt for the cargo until the cargo has been checked. A typical situation, the truck drives in with your cargo on it. The driver says, come on, offload, offload, I want to drive away. And you say, hang on, I need to check the cargo. The driver says, no, I've got to go. Please offload straight away. You're rushed into offloading. You haven't got time to check the cargo. The driver pushes for a signature. Never sign a clean receipt unless you've checked the cargo. The golden rule is if you haven't got time to check the cargo before the driver wants to go, always write unchecked or cargo not yet checked before you sign that receipt. That way, if there is anything wrong with the cargo, you can make an insurance claim. If there is a claim, always advise the insurance company immediately. And a little game that we play is if you want to make a claim, always hold the last carrier responsible. So you've got a shipment arriving at your warehouse. It's moved by container, then by road to your warehouse. It arrives at your warehouse. You see you need to make an insurance claim. One of the things you have to do is hold the last carrier responsible, which is probably going to be the road haulage company that delivered the material to your warehouse. You write to them and hold them responsible. Even if you know they weren't responsible, you still do that. It's a bit of a game. They will probably write back to you and say, we refute responsibility, and they will hold the previous carrier responsible, which may be the port authority. They will write back to them, we refute responsibility, and hold the previous carrier responsible, which could be the shipping line. Everyone goes back and back and back. And the reason why it's important to do that, because it means if the insurance company or when the insurance company pay out on the claim by the importer, they can then at least make a partial recovery from the carrier under carrier's liability. That's why you have to do that. But if you don't make a claim on the last carrier, then the insurance company can't make a recovery from them. That's why it's important to do it. So that's really what it comes down to. Insurance is important. There's a relationship between Incoterms and insurance. We can see where the risk passes, but insurance is only can pass through with CIP and CIF, but it's hugely, hugely important. And some wonderful pictures to really underline the importance of insurance. Things can go wrong. Containers don't float well, except when they've got one of your very heavy metals in. Probably they might float for a couple of minutes before they sink. Do remember, incidentally, look at that picture on the top right and also on the bottom left. Remember, insufficient packaging, if you pack your metals or your minerals, whatever they may be, if you do pack them, remember, insufficient packing is never an insurable risk. If your goods haven't got sufficient packaging, you will not be covered by insurance. The insurance will be invalid. You've always got to make sure that packing is sufficient according to the transit and the mode of transport. There we've got a railway accident, as you can see. That ship was on fire. This ship is still on fire. There we've got a road traffic accident. That incidentally, and this one here, these are two examples of when general average was used. I spoke about general average a few minutes ago. If you look at APL China on the bottom right, they had to throw into the sea, I think it was about 100 containers. So everyone else who had containers on that ship, there's about 5,000 containers. Everyone else who had containers had to contribute to the loss of those who had their containers thrown into the sea. General average declared when the ship was saved, when the APL China arrived at destination, everyone had to pay their general average contribution before they could take delivery of their containers. And in some cases, the contribution was really high. So that's just something to bear in mind. My favourite picture, which unfortunately caused me a great deal of embarrassment, because I used this picture when I was talking at quite a high-profile international logistics conference. I had this slide in my slide set, and I hadn't realised there was another speaker because they changed speakers. I hadn't realised there was another speaker speaking after me who actually came from Maersk Line, the shipping line. So he got very upset when I used this slide. I did apologise, and we made friends afterwards. But as you can see, it's not great. But there we go. So just some pictures. Incidentally, this picture you can see at the moment is interesting. This aircraft crash landed at Heathrow about 10, 12 years ago now, and no one was hurt. It landed short of the runway. But the reason why it's interesting is that purely coincidentally, I met the British Airways cargo loss adjuster at a conference a few months later. And bearing in mind that's a passenger plane, most air cargo is carried on passenger planes. And as you can see, the cargo holds are at the bottom of the plane. And this guy, the loss adjuster, he told me that on that aircraft there was 300 consignments of air freight, 300 separate consignments of air freight, and he told me only 3 of the 300 had adequate insurance. All the cargo was completely lost, all of it was damaged, but he told me only 3 out of the 300 consignments had adequate insurance. The rest of them just relied on British Airways liability. And remember, carrier's liability is a very, very low level. Remember, carrier's liability of cargo is based on the weight of the cargo, not the value of the cargo. So you will never get a full recovery if you just rely on carrier's liability. So that's something quite important, because I hear it quite often. People say to me, "Oh, I haven't insured the cargo because the shipping line, they've got a liability, or the airline, they've got a liability, or the rail company, they've got a liability." And it's true, they have. They have a carrier's liability, but it really is a low level of liability. It's not the same as having proper cargo insurance. There we go. So before we move on to documentation for the final session, any questions on insurance?
Maybe not a question, but finally it works. Those general insurance works like on the roads with a car. Yeah, maybe in the European Union to
Yeah.
be especially that everybody gives his money to the one who is going to crash.
To the cheapest freight cost.
To the cheapest, maybe. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and isn't that true? That's such a true comment, isn't it? What I always say, Peter, is that, of course, freight rates are important. They really are important because of competitiveness, but you get what you pay for. That's a reality as well. And I think this is really true when we talk about the international transport of goods. And what I always say to people is if the freight rate is lower than is the normal rate, there's going to be a reason for that. Of course, there's a reason. You do get what you pay for. You really do. And buyers and sellers need to realize that. They really need to realize that you may get a very, very low freight rate, but the reason for that could be because the trucks aren't up to standard, they haven't got a good bonding, so the carrier's liability can be very, very low. They're not professional in what they do. They've got loads of pickup points. There could be lots of reasons for that.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you made that point because I think it's so true. In international transport, you do get what you paid for. You really do. So thanks for identifying that.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
What is the best insurance, let's say, or for against the theft? Because many insurance companies do not cover that.
They will cover theft under Clause A insurance. Clause A is virtually all risks. So if you get, and in fact Clause B as well. Clause C won't cover that, but Clause A insurance and Clause B insurance that will cover theft. Again, as always, it's a really good point, and thank you for asking. That's a really good point. Always look at it. But I think when insurance is being contracted for the movement of goods, it's always important to state what clause you want, and always good to look at exclusions. But I'm glad you raised that because, from my point of view, I would always say, always make sure that the coverage does include pilferage and theft. Supply chains can be long. If we think back from last week, they can be quite fragmented as well. So you've got loads of activity points, loads of critical points in the supply chain, and that can mean there's lots of, if you like, what's the right word? There are a lot of points where there could be theft or pilfering of cargoes. So really good point to check that pilferage is actually covered.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another question, how to avoid, let's say, because very often insurance companies started to kind of, when it's theft is appeared, they wait for the police decision or some courts. Is there any remedy, I would say, in order to push the insurance companies to pay as soon as possible?
Well, it's another good point. I mean, they have insurance companies they've got to follow due process, which is fair enough. And that could mean doing cargo surveys, which is very normal, doing inspections, that's very normal. They may want to see documentation, all that kind of stuff. But in most cases, it should not be a prolonged process in most cases. And again, I think it's a really good point. You get what you pay for. When contracting an insurance company, it's always good to ask them, and look at surveys and see what is their record of claim success. What is their speed of meeting claims? That's really important. The Trustpilot kind of thing. How well do they do? If you make a claim on day one, how many days or weeks will it take, or months even, to get the claim paid? So that's why in Incoterms it mentions using an insurance company of good repute, good reputation. Because if you do that, then there's a kind of presumption that they can pay claims fairly quickly. But it is the same with any kind of insurance, because all insurance companies reinsure. They all do that. And they want to make sure they can get a recovery. So what I always say is, if you contract the insurance with a good insurance company, good reputation, you have to do that under Incoterms. If you make sure that an appropriate Institute Cargo clause is used. Make sure there aren't inappropriate exclusions. Make sure your documentation is complete and correct. Make sure you're using an appropriate Incoterm for the contract. Then the claim should be able to be pursued very, very quickly. But if just one element of that isn't as it should be, that can delay the whole process. But a lot of it, I think, comes down to selecting, an insurance company that does have a good reputation. A lot of it is dependent on that.
That's the matter. So especially on CIP conditions, when it's your supplier make a decision concerning the insurance company, especially some regions like Central Asia, where we do not have the access to internationally reputed companies.
Well, they should do. I mean, I think, it goes back to the contract, really, where, if you're buying CIP, then they have to carry out the insurance. If you're not happy with the insurance they provide, then buy CPT, and then you can arrange the insurance yourself, in Europe, wherever you are. But even if you buy CIP, then you can lay down the conditions of the insurance, and if they don't provide insurance with the correct level of insurance that you've agreed in the contract, then they're in breach of contract. But I think it's a good point. And what I would say is, if you're not confident of the level of insurance that could be contracted in the country of supply, then buy CPT instead of CIP and arrange the insurance yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Because someone's going to have to pay for it. So
Yeah.
whether they pay for it and they charge you for it, or you just arrange it directly, I think that's what I would do. If I'm not happy with the provision by the seller, I would arrange it myself, I think. Does that answer that okay?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for
Really,
the
you're
advice.
very welcome. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay, then very briefly, a quick look through documentation. Again, it's quite a big subject, but we'll just do a quick flip through it all. In international trade, I think we can, there's a bundle of documents which can be, even in the most simple transaction, there can be a lot of documents involved. And the way I tend to divide them is between movement documents and commercial documents. So movement documents, the best way to think about that, they provide the ticket for the journey. I think we may have touched on this last week. Just like when you're a passenger on a bus, a plane, a train, a boat, you get a ticket for the journey. Cargo has a ticket as well, and that's the movement document. And with cargo, the movement document depends on the mode of transport. So if it's sea freight, we're going to have bills of lading or express bills of lading. If it's air freight, we're going to have airway bills, house airway bills, or master airway bills. If it's road freight, we're going to have road consignment notes. And if the countries concerned are signatories of the CMR Convention, they will be based on the CMR document. For rail freight, we're going to have COTIF or CIM notes. And for deliveries to freight forwarders, particularly under FCA consignments, we're going to have forwarders' certificates of receipt. So the transport document is going to be dependent on the mode of transport. But every transport document has some things in common. They're very, very similar. They'll always have things like who is the consignor, who is the consignee? What's the loading point and what's the discharge point? Who is the carrier? The name of the ship, the flight number, the rail wagon number, the truck number. What are the goods? What is the weight of the goods? What's the measurement of the goods? Have they been dispatched? Those are going to be the key points on the document. So every transport document will have that in common. And the key thing they'll have in common is they'll provide evidence of the contract of carriage. So when the bill of lading or the airway bill or the road consignment note or the rail consignment note, when they're issued, they evidence the contract of carriage between the cargo owner, depending on the Incoterm, the seller or the buyer, and the carrier themselves. Now, the conditions of carriage will sometimes be on the back of the document. So, for example, with some bills of lading, if you look on the back of them, those will be the conditions of carriage. No one ever reads them until something goes wrong, but that's where the conditions of carriage will be. If they're not on the back of the document, by law, the document must refer to them. So if the conditions of carriage aren't named on the document is allowed to say, subject to our standard conditions of carriage, you will find these at website da 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 da. So even if the document itself doesn't have the conditions of carriage, it must allude to what the conditions of carriage are and where the trader can find them. So whether it's road, rail, sea or air, the document is evidence that there is a contract of carriage between the contracting party and the carrier themselves. There'll be evidence the goods have been shipped. There'll be evidence the cargo has been received by the carrier. And a bit unusual now, but in some cases, they could be the freight receipt as well. In other words, receipt of the freight invoice. That's quite unusual now, but occasionally you see that. Now, as I said, the document issued by the carrier would depend on the mode of transport. Now, let's get rid of the easy ones first. For road, for rail, for courier shipment, for postal shipment, you simply get a receipt for the goods, an indication of dispatch of the goods. So for air freight, it would be an airway bill. If it's issued directly by the airline, the carrier, it's called a master airway bill. If it's issued by a freight forwarder on behalf of the carrier, it's called a house airway bill. Legally, they both have exactly the same standing. Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's a master airway bill or a house airway bill, they have legally the same standing. They're a receipt for the cargo and a notification of dispatch. Road freight, very, very similar. As I mentioned, it's a CMR note. Rail freight, a CIM note. Courier receipt, it's going to be a courier note. Postal receipt, it's going to be a postal receipt. Now, the big difference is with shipping line bills of lading. With a negotiable bill of lading, those are different to every other transport document. The big difference is if it's made out in a certain way, a bill of lading can be a negotiable document and a document of title. Negotiable document means that ownership of the goods can be changed by using the bill of lading. And that integrates with the fact that it can be a document of title. And because of all of that, when a cargo, a sea cargo, arrives at destination, legally, the consignee can only take delivery of that cargo if they submit one of the original bills of lading to the carrier. That's called surrendering the original bill of lading. So they're exchanging the original bill of lading, which represents the cargo, they're exchanging that for the cargo itself. And legally, when a consignment arrives at a port, legally, an importer cannot take delivery until they have surrendered an original bill of lading, not a copy, one of the original bills of lading to the carrier. They can't take delivery under any other circumstances legally. So that's a very, very key difference between bills of lading and all the other transport documents. And I think you all know what bills of lading look like. As you can imagine from what I've just said, a bill of lading is a really important legal heavy document, which has an intrinsic value. And that's why the examples I'm showing you, that's why, before the shipping lines would give me the samples, that's why they put the word specimen on them. Because a bill of lading, when completed, an original bill of lading, is a hugely important document. If I've got an original in my hand, if I find one in the street outside my house, in theory, I can pick it up, I can go to the port of arrival and demand the shipping line give me the goods by surrendering that original bill of lading, because it can give me title to the goods, but only if I'm named on it or if it's endorsed to my order. So a really important document. There's another example. They're all very, very similar. There's a standard layout for bills of lading. All very similar. There we go. If you charter a ship, if you've got enough cargo to rent a whole ship, that's what a charter party bill of lading looks like. It has a different legal standing to a liner bill of lading. But, if you drill down, the information is going to be virtually the same. And there's a copy of a road consignment note just so that you know what one looks like. Okay, we then have commercial documentation, and there's a bundle of it. So, for example, you can see some examples there. We can have documentation to prove the origin of the goods. And that can be documents like a GSP certificate, an EUR1 document showing preferential origin, a certificate of origin showing non-preferential origin. You know, there's a bundle of different documents you can have. In the European Union, there's a gradual migration of paper proof of origin to electronic, and that's called the REX system used in the European Union. And that's, you know, gaining traction globally. We're seeing more and more of that. Quite interesting. You know, sometimes you see developing countries overtaking developed countries. And in relation to proving origin, it was the SADC region of Southeast Africa that started to have electronic proof of origin. You know, and they've had that for about 10 years now. In Europe, it's relatively new. So that's quite interesting. So in the EU, as I've mentioned, gradually migrating to an electronic system called REX. Inspection certificates, I think on the course we've got someone from an inspection company. If the goods need inspection prior to shipment, if pre-shipment inspection is required, then of course some kind of clean report of inspection or report of inspection, which may be a non-negotiable report or a report of findings, would be issued. Sometimes there may be a requirement for a traceability certificate or a test certificate. A packing list is a standard requirement. And of course, there will always be a commercial invoice. We'll come on to that in a minute. And if it's a CIP or CIF transaction, there will be a requirement for an insurance document. So export invoices, what's going to be the standard content of an export invoice? And this is what you would expect to see on an export invoice. And most of it, I think, is pretty obvious. There's going to be a description of the goods and the quantity of the goods or the weight of the goods if it's a commodity, the addresses of seller or buyer, the method of payment and currency of payment. We're going to talk about payments tomorrow, of course. The Incoterm governing the contract, remember, made out in the way we spoke about last week, 3-letter code, subject to Incoterms 2020, and the named place of final destination. So that's going to be on there. Any statements, different countries have different requirements. You check, I'm selling to China, do I have to put a declaration on the invoice? Some countries, it can be a small declaration, I hereby certify this invoice is true and correct. So you have to look at country regulations. Is a special declaration needed? If you're trading within the European Union, you have to put VAT numbers of seller and buyer. The packaging units, weights and dimensions, they don't have to be on the commercial invoice in most countries. Generally, you can have a separate packing list, but you know, why not combine the two? It makes things easier and have everything on one document. It makes sense to do that. There may be destination country requirements. For example, you may have to give a complete breakdown of price, maybe from FCA to CIP value. You show the FCA value, then you show the freight cost, then you show the insurance cost, then you show the total CIP. Some countries have that requirement. So there may be a destination country requirement. You may have to show preference and sometimes even non-preference origin, depending on whether you're claiming a preference. Commodity code, always good to put that on the export invoice, up to 6 digits. And remember, some countries still require signed invoices. Signatures are going out of date. Most countries realize signatures aren't necessary, but some countries still need signed invoices. So my recommendation is always the same thing. If in doubt, sign the invoice. It can't do any harm. And there are some examples of documents. A standard non-preference certificate of origin, the layout tends to be the same. When the UK left the European Union, we had to have our own document, so that's a UK certificate of origin. But whether you're in the States, whatever country you're in, non-preference origin will have the same kind of format of certificate of origin, and that's what they're going to look like. There's an example of an EUR1 for claiming preference within the European Union. Again, they're still in use, But in the EU, there's a migration to the electronic REX system for proving origin. So EUR1's currently still in use, but they are dying out. And most countries that have trade agreements with the European Union have gone over to the electronic system. And there's an example of a GSP certificate. I'm sorry, it's a bit cloudy because it's a green document and it doesn't really scan very well, but that's what it looks like. And there's an example of an insurance certificate for a CIP or CIF transaction. No standard layout of an insurance document, but they tend to look like the one you can see on the screen. Very, very straightforward. You would have on there the name of the conveyance, in other words, the name of the ship, the flight number, the rail number, or whatever, where it's going from, where it's going to, marks and numbers of the consignment, description of the goods, and the insured value. And it will be signed. If it's CIP or CIF, it will be signed on the back by the exporter so that the importer can make the insurance claim. Remember, with a document like that, always look for exclusions. If you think the insurance rate is low or it seems too good to be true, even if you don't, even if you think it's a good, it's a reasonable rate, always look to see if there are any exclusions. There we go. So that's it for today. This is what we're going to cover tomorrow. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And as I hoped, we've got some minutes left. So any questions or comments, any worries, anything going to give you nightmares tonight in relation to what we've been speaking about?
No nightmares.
No nightmares. Okay, glad to hear that. So that's it from me, except that once again, thank you all very much for your attention, which I really appreciate. Thank you for that. Tomorrow, everyone should be really excited because we're talking money tomorrow. Export credit control, how you get paid, and letters of credit. That's what we're going to be doing tomorrow. And the intent tomorrow is we'll follow the normal format. But at the end tomorrow, I really want to try, we'll see how the timing goes. Hopefully we can kind of finish me talking at about 4 o'clock UK time tomorrow. And then we'll have half an hour, I hope, where we can take any Q&A for the whole 4 modules that we've done. So in the meantime, thank you very much for your attention, everyone. Have a lovely evening, everyone. Thanks, Polina, for managing the whole thing. And over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for today's seminar. If any questions arise in your mind afterwards, please feel free to put them forward tomorrow to send them to me, and I can put them across. We reconvene tomorrow at the same time, which is 1 p.m. UK time. That's 1 p.m. BST. That's UTC +1. And the slides will be available after tomorrow, and I'll also prepare the recordings for you so that they can be shared. If you haven't had access to recordings, although I believe I've enabled your access, if you haven't had it yet, please let me know and I'll enable you to access it. So that's it. Have a good evening, and I'll see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, Polina.
Bye.
Nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.